Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that the microphone's okay for the recording, so I don't have to hold it. But as Chris said, welcome to the finance track. This is the second year of this conference, as you may well know, but this is the first time having the finance track. Thank you to the sponsors specifically for this track of Open Invention Network. As Amanda just said, none of this happens without volunteers and sponsors, so we appreciate that. And speaking of volunteers, thank you, Paula and Chris, for your work that you've done for this track as well. As I mentioned, we have an interesting lineup today, and I hope that you can attend. I think there'll be something for everyone, I believe. I'm trying to kick it off today just to talk about, maybe at a bit of a high level, financial services, the finance area, maybe might feel newer to embracing open source. Is that true? Is that not true? Who's using it? And how to do some practical implementations if it is new to you. A little bit more about me, if you will. You might notice from my accent, I'm not from around here. I actually live in the United States in the Pacific Northwest. I have the good fortune of living in the state of Oregon. If anybody's familiar with it, it's pretty fabulous. I live an hour east of Portland, so I'm in a small town, beautiful mountain views, and have the opportunity, I would say, partially through open source, to be able to work remote, which has been fabulous. My journey to open source, as I say in my former life, I was a banker. I actually traded currency for a number of years. I took a break from my career, and when I started back up in the workforce, I fell into open source, and that was in 2008, and I've been here ever since, and it's a pretty fabulous community. What drives me, as you can see, open source. I also, when I'm not working, I love to be out in nature when I can be, and I would label myself as a lifelong learner. Love to read, always continuing to learn. Events like this just feed me because you get to have exchange of ideas, learn from other folks, and also share what you've had as well. So here we are. What are we going to cover today? As I mentioned, want to make sure that we're looking at what is the current landscape, some challenges. Some of them might be perceived challenges. Some of them are actual challenges for folks. Who's using open source in the finance space? And then maybe some approaches to take or consider if you haven't done so already. So to understand where we are today, it's always useful to kind of look back in time. Maybe not our favorite time to look back to, but back at the end of 2007, and I will preface, probably not the best part as an American and what we did at this point in time, but we have to own our mistakes, if you will. The housing sector really was the catalyst for a financial crisis that took place, and we saw that really peak then in 2008. Why that might be interesting to this group here in finance is it really, really had a terrible impact in banking, for sure. And I highlight this section of the bank failures and liquidity crunch, and oh, wait, that was 2008. It feels a little bit like 2022 and SVB and 2023 and all that. But things came out of that for sure. And as I mentioned, part of the unfortunate piece is that financial crisis pushed completely worldwide. However, when you have that worldwide change or that worldwide impact, what happened from crisis, right, is that it was really clear things had to change. And the good news is they have in many ways, right? So, Charlie has a lot of interesting comments, but this one just resonates to me in thinking about whenever there's a crisis, there tends to be then opportunity for innovation, right? And some of it is those forward thinkers. Some of it is just demanded upon us by our customers and by the market. That's absolutely something that we saw coming out of that crisis in 2008. We're seeing that customers then started to demand a better way. So we're seeing that financial services, they expect to have financial services in any location at any time. It also coincides with the rise of smartphones and mobile apps and just it's everywhere, right? So how do we evolve? How does the finance industry, how does fintech evolve and grow and shape, again, some of this coming out of crisis? This slide here shows a snapshot in 2014. And for those of you who are math people and say, and it doesn't add up to 100%, this is showing adults that have a formal relationship with a financial institution. And then of that, the interesting part in terms of the fintech sector is in 2014, who had made or received financial payments, right? So you can see the difference and the disparity between developing countries and then the high income economies, what that difference was. So 2014. Jump ahead then to look and see what happened come 2021. Well, good news is that percentage, we're getting a little bit closer to 100% in high income, and we also have seen some nice gains as well in the developing economies as well of people having exposure and the opportunity to be working with financial institutions. All boats rise. That's not specifically what this talk is about, but I think it also resonates with me because of what open source is and how open source helps democratize. We're seeing this also in fintech and with the advent of different tools that people are coming with. So as we've seen and had this shift taking place in traditional banking into the fintech services, when we start looking at specifically on open source, what we're starting to see is not only, and I'll talk about it a little bit later as well, not only are more financial companies being willing to use open source, and I would contend there's people have been using it for a long time, particularly Java. You've seen that around with Linux and all that. But we're also starting to see contributing back and open sourcing themselves. So if anybody here is new to open source and is just learning, there's you can be a user or you could be a producer. How do you combine all those together, right? So it's great to see that if there's an area within finance and fintech that may be slower because of the conservative nature, thank you, with dealing with their money, maybe slower to adopt some of these technologies, it's great to see that now understanding the value and starting to give back as well. So back in 2023, FINOS, with those of you who aren't familiar with FINOS, they are here, but it stands for the FinTech Open Source Foundation. They are a part of the Linux Foundation. They did a large survey in 22 and in 23, but in 2023, in the respondents saying, yeah, we think that 88%, that's a really high percentage, that they believe that it's going to be valuable for their organization. And it went up even more so that 90% understand that it should be valuable for the industry in general, right? Maybe for a lot of us in the room, that's not new news, right? Just validates what you're already doing. Where's the most valuable part of open source? Well, I think that this might be my only slide that has AI on it, but it wouldn't be like, how could you not have AI in a slide? We just had a whole morning, 2 hours worth of talking about where we're at. That's obviously a key component. Cybersecurity, security, and we'll talk about again a little bit more as well. That's obviously hugely important within fintech and all of us I'm in the database space. Data is gold, right? We need to make sure that we're protecting that and taking care of that. And then also cloud and container. Those seem to be, I would say that's almost ubiquitous across all industries. It's not specific to this vertical, but definitely top of mind for folks here as well. Also top of mind in the economy that we're in right now is we still are dealing with inflation. We still have feelings of recession. I mean, I don't know which economists you all read, but sometimes it's a little conflicting, like, oh, soft landing, oh, not, oh, wait, we're not out of the woods, oh, wait, I have no idea. Bottom line, I know that I have to report to people to say, how am I continuing our profitable growth? How am I making sure that I understand that we're adding value to our customers? Because that's what it's all about. And what are tools that we can use to do that? And that's a great conversation for open source. I would say in general, you see open source, at least the conversations spiked. They spiked in 2008. During the pandemic, people started thinking about it as well. Right now, again, it shouldn't only be a cost play, but let's be realistic, there's cost. So what are some advantages for open source? When you think about development, it could be time to market, right? Time to value, because you may not be starting from scratch. And you hear, and we listen to how you start with the community and great ideas that are already happening. You can be a part of that conversation. Or as I mentioned, you could be a user of that technology. That's what open source is about. So that can help you get your value that much more quickly. Also, cost of development. Again, how do you scale your team? The company, like Percona, we're resource constrained. We're all resource constrained to a certain degree. Where are you employing that? By being part of an open source community, you get to excel, amplify your developers. If you're forming your groups correctly, it helps that along as well. And then a third advantage is attracting and retaining talent. I'll be frank, right? When we have openings, we might go look into our forums and look at people who've been contributing to our projects and being engaged and reaching out and saying, hey, we've seen the work that you've done. We see the passion that you have. Would you consider working for us? It's a great opportunity, and it's also just a sharing of the minds. Also, conferences like this highlight that. Amanda had said part of it is, jobs, but it's something where when you create out in the open, you can see that. So that's another advantage for folks. So let's talk about the challenges, because, right, there can be challenges. Some of them are perceived, some of them are actual, right? So we've got security, we've got the regulatory nature of finance, and then if you're new, again, if this is a newer process, there's going to be winning the hearts and minds of your staff. So I like to talk about secure by design. How many in here would say they're creative? And I would put engineers and developers as creatives. Yeah. I appreciate all you. I'm not a creative, but I appreciate all you. Secure by design might not be your first thought, right? It might be, ooh, I got this cool problem I want to attack. How do I handle that? And also when you start talking to folks about open source, the first question can be, is it really secure? I'm happy to say that, yes, it's really secure. There's been studies since the early 2000s asking that question and poking around, is open source more vulnerable than maybe closed source? And it's proven out, no. Software development can be vulnerable. So yes, you put something out in the open, are there potential, let's say, would-be hackers that are going to go and find vulnerabilities for you? Sure, that can happen. Likewise, what we actually see is what we call the white hat hackers that openly are doing this and looking and saying, hey, I was just looking at your code. I see a vulnerability. Here's a fix. That's out in the community. That's not reliant on one vendor. So when it's closed source, if there's a vulnerability, then you're reliant on that one vendor to make sure that you handle that, and you might not see that same piece. So we've seen the headlines. We see the headlines for closed source. We've seen the headlines for open source. I would say that it's always the responsibility to make sure that you're thinking about security by design. So if folks have this misnomer that open source is not as secure, I hope you leave without that thought any longer, would be what I say. We understand that finance is, and the Fintech, it's a heavily regulated industry. So there are additional considerations that need to be taken when developing and that you need to handle, right? So you always have to make sure that you have your operational resiliency. There's the compliance piece. Again, that's secure by design. And what I would say is that whether you're in Fintech directly, creating apps, or a financial institution, or a vendor, that compliance piece is really key. And it's an understood, it could be a challenge for those who are maybe in the vendor space, like we are, making sure that you're taking the time to understand it, absorb the cost of making sure that you have the compliance as well. You're not going to get around that. But with that, it also comes back to the education and educating internally, educating developers, and also educating regulators, which is a reason to get involved and understand. I just mentioned Finos. Look at best practices. The Finos group just put out last year a new project as an example of how do you bring together, in some cases, competitors, right? Like clearly, if you look on their project group, it's some of the large, major worldwide banks that obviously are competing against one another. Yet they have the same problem that they're trying to solve. What does it look like to be up in the cloud? How do you do cloud controls? How do you deal? Each of the hyperscalers might have a different way of deploying it. By bringing a group together and with an open source, then you have that opportunity to jointly solve that problem, do open standards, really for the benefit of all, right? On any side of the equation, it's really helpful. I would contend that sometimes that's a mind shift. That's a mind shift, and it's not that easy for everybody to wrap their head around because, at least in my world, right, I'm a very competitive person, right? That drives you, that's what you're used to, and then you're like, oh, wait, I'm going to sit in the same room and go solve a problem with somebody that I'm supposed to be competing against? Yep, because it's actually for the better good. So again, encouraging folks to consider different organizations that are out there. I find it comforting that I'm not solving a problem alone. I don't know if others feel that way, but that's something I look at. Another challenge can be winning the hearts and minds. And this can be internally and externally, but in this one I'm really going to talk about internally. We kind of joke, I joke, at Percona we have a discussion between the geeks and the suits. I'm a suit, and I get reminded by that a lot by people that, oh, she's a suit. But I feel like I can talk geek sometimes. But if you're bringing in folks into your company or are already in your company that haven't done open source before, it can be, I will say, a large learning curve to help them understand what it is. And you have to be able to show value across the business and have this conversation across the different teams. As an example, just last week, there was the 2024 State of Open Source report that was put out by OpenLogic, Open Source Initiative, and the Eclipse Foundation. And in that survey, which is awesome, you should go check it out. I'm sorry I don't have the link here because I was traveling as it came out, and I'm like, whoo, fiddling with my slides even more is probably not a good idea. But in that report, they had asked a question about what has been the usage of open source in your company over the past year. And when they spliced all the data and they looked at it, of the C-suite respondents, 40% of those respondents said, oh, open source is about the same as what it was. The technical side of the house, 60% said open source is increasing. Okay, so there's a little bit of a disconnect, and how do you have that conversation? How do you make sure that you're winning the hearts and minds? And I've used this word before, I'll use it again. It's about showing value. How do you make sure that there's value? Value to your customers always first and foremost is my belief. But then internally, who you're talking to, how does it value the business? How does it value a developer? How does, there's vulnerabilities that people will have, like feeling vulnerable, maybe being out in the open if they've only done closed or SaaS or something like that. So sometimes as leaders, we might underestimate change management, hearts and minds. I would just encourage you to bear that in mind. So who is using open source today? I'm going to say everybody, but let's give some clear examples in this space. Lloyd's Banking Group and you see on this link, they put out and they talked about their journey. Seems pretty clear from what they just put out on their website that it's a newer journey that they've just started and trying to understand it and taking those steps and understanding the value. I bet they're doing a lot of hearts and minds right now that they're working on as well. So they're looking as being users of open source. NatWest is another great example, and they're an example of putting back. They've given, as you can see here, they've open sourced something that they've created themselves, and they're working with the Finos organization as well. So there's that opportunity of like, hey, in the past, we might have created a tool and kept it internally. Hey, let's look and put this out. Let's put this out to the community now. Last year at the Open Source Summer in North America in Vancouver, BC, Discover was one of the top sponsors. And they just wanted everybody to know, like, ah, it was almost like, ah, we found open source. But they're also doing it as inner source. And what was one of their use cases they discovered? I think if I remember the stat correctly, internally they had something like 10,000 developers. And they realized that some teams might be trying to solve a similar problem as another team, and they kept their code separate from each other. Like, if we think about going back, like how do you make money or inflation and controlling costs, you really don't want people duplicating efforts within your own company, right? So that's a start as well. This is just a slide of some of our customers at Percona. Again, we're in the database space that are in fintech and have been using open source databases. I highlight this to say your vendor ecosystem around open source is really important as well. Some of you might be at organizations that you have a requirement that if you're using any software you're using has to be supported. Something to be mindful of within open source. It allows you to not have vendor lock-in if done well, but you also want to make sure and understand who are the folks around in your ecosystem and how do you partner with them, because ideally, depending on where it is in your stack that you're using the software, let those folks handle that so you can be excellent at what you do and not be bothered with some of the others, if you will. So how is a good way to approach open source? What can you do? It's going to be a little bit repetitive of what I've already mentioned. You can be a user of open source. For those organizations and you're newer on the journey, and like Lloyd's had put out, they had started their open source program office. You tend to hear it as OSPO. Try not to use acronyms without identifying them first. That's a great way to make sure that you're compliant. Again, highly regulated. OSPOs are in all industries, but that's really a compliance piece to make sure that you understand the licenses you're involved in. If you're contributing to code, if you're using code, you want to make sure that that's understood by the organization. And also just looking for open source alternatives to proprietary software. Is there one out there that's robust enough and to fit your needs? There's lots of websites where you can look for those alternatives as well. Next thing you can consider doing is how do you contribute back to projects? So again, there's the difference between users and takers. Sounds negative, but it's the reality of how do you do a bit of both, right? So contribute back to projects, join foundations. And then join the conversation. The fact that you're all here and wanting to be a part of the conversation and in the heart of it, that's a great first step, and that's really at the heart of open source as well. Engage in the forums. I don't know if you had heard the last speaker earlier this morning talking about like going to Discord, finding different places where there is that community, where you can learn and where you can also join from. And then one that I don't know that we talk about quite enough is mentorship. How do we mentor internally? How do we mentor within the community? Whether it's early career folks or people who are transitioning or just, again, winning hearts and minds. Those are all things to consider to do. So as we're embracing and moving on right now is, if I leave you with anything, please consider or continue to embrace open source. It's been around. People are continuing to use it. You all are innovators here. If Fintech can continue to is innovative and disrupting the market, that's not going to change. It's only going to continue. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to connect. I'm on LinkedIn. I'll be around also the rest of today. Enjoy this track. We have a great lineup of speakers on diverse topics. And thank you for being here.